Picture this. A German officer sitting in a reinforced bunker somewhere in Normandy, July 1944, writing in his diary with hands that won't stop shaking. And the sentence he writes is not about artillery, not about tanks, not about air raids, but about darkness itself. About how night has become the enemy they can't shoot, can't outmaneuver, can't predict. Because when the sun goes down, the Canadians stop being soldiers and become something else entirely. Something that moves through shadows like they were born in them. And this diary, discovered decades later in an attic in Hamburg, reveals what official Wehrmacht reports deliberately omitted. That German officers feared nightfall more than they feared a direct assault. More than they feared running out of ammunition, because at least bullets you can see coming. The Canadians developed something between June and August 1944 that military historians didn't fully document until the 1990s. A night movement routine so precise, so psychologically devastating, that German positions would simply collapse before dawn without a major firefight ever taking place. And if you think this was about superior firepower or better equipment, you're about to discover it was something far more unsettling. Something that weaponized the one thing every soldier fears when they're exhausted and far from home. The feeling that you're being watched by something you can't see. Stay with me, because what made this technique so effective wasn't complexity, it was the opposite. It was so simple that German commanders couldn't believe professional soldiers would use it, and that disbelief cost them entire defensive lines. Let me take you back to June 7, 1944, day 2 after D-Day, when Canadian units pushing inland realized something the textbooks never taught them, that Norman hedgerows created perfect natural barriers during the day, but became psychological torture chambers at night, because visibility dropped to less than 10 meters, because every rustle could be enemy movement or just wind through wheat, because the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying these positions and knew every tree, every ditch, every approach, or so they thought. The first night a Canadian unit tried a standard advance, they lost 11 men to machine gun nests they never saw, positions that opened fire and went silent before anyone could return effective fire. And a young lieutenant named Morrison from Alberta sat in a crater at 3 a.m. with his surviving men and asked a question that would change everything. What if we stopped trying to see in the dark and started making them afraid of not seeing us? That sounds philosophical until you understand what he meant, because Morrison had grown up hunting elk in mountain terrain, where you don't chase the animal. You move so carefully, so patiently, that the animal doesn't know you're there until it's too late, and he wondered if the same principle could apply to German defensive positions, not overwhelming them with force, but making them feel hunted in their own bunkers. If you think this was supposed to be some elaborate special forces operation, it wasn't. It was regular infantry testing an idea that sounded ridiculous in daylight. What if we moved at night not to attack, but just to be present, to let them know we were out there, close enough to hear them breathing, and then disappeared before they could respond? The first test happened June 9th near Bretteville, where Morrison's platoon spent an entire night doing nothing but repositioning around a German strongpoint, never firing a shot, just moving every 20 minutes, letting their boots crunch on gravel just loud enough to be heard, letting their equipment clink against itself, and then going completely silent for 10 minutes, then moving again, closer. And the Germans inside that position fired over 800 rounds into darkness, at targets that were never where the sounds suggested, and by dawn they had burned through a third of their ammunition shooting at ghosts. The diary entry from the German officer commanding that position, discovered in 1998, describes that night as worse than being shelled, because at least with artillery, you know it ends, you know the barrage stops. But this was continuous psychological pressure, the certainty that enemy soldiers were circling them in the dark, the inability to confirm whether the sounds were real threats or deliberate deception, and most disturbing, the realization at sunrise that Canadian casualties were zero, while German ammunition stocks were critically depleted. Morrison reported this to his battalion commander, who thought he was insane until he saw the results. A fortified position that had held for 3 days surrendered on June 10th, not because they were overrun, but because the men inside were too exhausted to function, having spent 72 hours in rotating states of panic every time darkness fell, never knowing if that sound outside was a real attack or just more psychological warfare. Now here's where military bureaucracy almost killed this before it spread, because when Morrison wrote up his after-action report using phrases like psychological night pressure and presence without engagement, staff officers in the rear classified it as unorthodox and potentially against the conventions of warfare, as if there's a rule that says you can't walk around enemy positions making noise. And the report would have died in a filing cabinet, except that 3 other Canadian units in completely different sectors reported similar spontaneous tactics emerging independently. Platoons that discovered on their own that German defensive doctrine fell apart when subjected to sustained night activity that followed no recognizable pattern. The Germans had trained for everything: direct assault, infiltration, artillery preparation, armor breakthrough, but they had not trained for an enemy that seemed content to just exist in the darkness around them, that showed up in different places every 20 minutes, that never attacked during these night movements, but made it impossible to sleep, impossible to relax, impossible to maintain the discipline that German military culture demanded. One Wehrmacht captain wrote in his diary that he preferred British units because, at least the British attack like civilized soldiers, they assault positions, they follow doctrine, but these Canadians from the night patrols, they don't follow any doctrine we recognize. They move like hunters, not soldiers. And that phrase, like hunters, shows up in multiple German accounts from different sectors, suggesting this wasn't isolated perception, but a widespread recognition that something about Canadian night tactics fundamentally differed from standard Allied procedure, and the difference was cultural. It came from a country where large portions of the male population grew up in rural areas where winter hunting meant tracking animals through snow and darkness, where you learned patience not as a virtue, but as survival skill, where you understood that the predator who wins isn't always the fastest or strongest, but the one who understands how to use environment and timing. By late June 1944, Canadian Command realized they had accidentally discovered something doctrine manuals didn't cover, and instead of standardizing it into formal procedure, they did something unusual. They encouraged units to develop their own variations as long as the core principle remained, which was sustained nighttime presence without premature engagement. Let the enemy know you're there. Let them burn energy and ammunition responding to your movements. And attack only when they're exhausted and depleted, not when they're alert and supplied. This drove German intelligence officers insane because they couldn't pattern it, couldn't predict it, couldn't develop countermeasures against tactics that changed from unit to unit, night to night, sector to sector. And the intelligence reports from July 1944 show German analysis becoming increasingly desperate, trying to find the structure behind Canadian night operations, trying to identify the training manual they were following, never understanding that there was no manual, just a principle that company commanders adapted to their specific terrain and enemy positions. If you're wondering why this never became famous like D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge, it's because it doesn't look impressive on paper. There are no dramatic last stands, no heroic charges, no tanks exploding in spectacular fashion, just months of German defensive positions slowly crumbling under psychological pressure, applied night after night after night, positions that should have held for weeks surrendering after days, because the men inside them stopped being combat effective, not from wounds, but from exhaustion, from the mental strain of never knowing when darkness would bring another round of invisible movement around their perimeter. Let me give you a specific example that appears in both Canadian and German archives. On July 15th, a German position near Caen held by a reinforced company, roughly 180 men, well supplied, good fields of fire, everything doctrine says should hold for a week minimum against equivalent attacking force, and a Canadian company started their night routine, not attacking, just moving, repositioning, making their presence known. And by July 18th, the German company commander requested permission to withdraw, not because they were being overrun, but because his men were hallucinating from lack of sleep, firing at sounds that weren't there, refusing to leave their bunkers even in daylight. And when Canadian forces finally assaulted that position on July 19th, they found it defended by less than 40 combat-effective soldiers. The rest had either deserted, were in shock, or were physically present, but mentally checked out. The German battalion commander who authorized that withdrawal was later investigated by his own command for abandoning a defensible position without adequate reason. And his defense, documented in military tribunal records, was that Canadian night operations constituted psychological warfare on a scale he had no training or doctrine to counter. And the tribunal quietly dropped the investigation because too many other German officers were reporting the same phenomenon, that positions were becoming untenable, not from damage but from morale collapse triggered by Canadian night activity. Now, the diary that brought all this to public attention wasn't discovered until 1996, when a German veteran's grandson was cleaning out his grandfather's attic in Hamburg and found notebooks his grandfather had kept but never shown anyone. And these notebooks, particularly entries from July and August 1944, describe in brutal detail what it felt like to be on the receiving end of Canadian night tactics. And the grandson, being a history student, recognized this wasn't standard war memoir material. This was primary source documentation of something historians had barely acknowledged, and he donated them to the military archives, where researchers realized these entries corroborated Canadian unit reports that had been dismissed as exaggerated. The diary author was a lieutenant who commanded a platoon-sized position south of Caen, and his entries start professional, tactical, normal military observations about enemy strength and movements. But by the third week of Canadian night operations, his writing deteriorates, sentences become fragments. He starts describing sounds he's hearing, questioning whether they're real, writing about how his men are afraid to relieve themselves outside their bunkers at night because they're convinced Canadians are waiting in the darkness just meters away. And the horrible part is they were probably right. Canadian accounts confirm that sometimes entire squads would position themselves within 30 meters of German positions and just wait there for hours, not attacking, just being present, letting the Germans sense their presence without being able to confirm it. One diary entry from July 28th describes a moment when this lieutenant heard footsteps outside his bunker at 2 a.m., close enough that he could hear gravel crunching, and he didn't fire, didn't alert his men, because by that point he had learned that firing brought more movement, more sounds, more invisible repositioning, and he just sat there in the dark, listening to someone walk past his position so close he could hear their breathing. And when dawn came, there were fresh boot prints in the mud, less than 5 meters from his entrance. Proof that it wasn't imagination. Proof that Canadians had been that close and chosen not to attack. Chosen instead to let him know they could have attacked, which somehow was worse. If you think German command didn't understand what was happening, they did. They absolutely did. There are orders from late July 1944 instructing units facing Canadian sectors to maintain strict fire discipline at night, to not respond to sounds or movement unless visual confirmation of enemy presence exists, essentially telling their men to ignore the psychological pressure. But this order was impossible to follow because human beings under stress don't follow logic. They follow fear. And when you're sitting in a bunker at 3 a.m., and you hear equipment clinking 20 meters away, your training says don't fire, but your survival instinct says empty your magazine at that sound, and survival instinct won repeatedly, which is exactly what the Canadians counted on. By August 1944, German replacement troops being sent to sectors facing Canadian units were briefed specifically about night operations, told what to expect, told how to maintain discipline, and it didn't matter. Knowing what was coming didn't make it easier to endure. If anything, it made it worse because they spent every day dreading nightfall, knowing that when the sun set, the psychological pressure would start again. And this anticipatory anxiety was almost as damaging as the actual night movements, because soldiers were burning mental energy, worrying about something that hadn't happened yet, arriving at darkness already partially defeated. The technique spread through Canadian forces, not through formal training but through word of mouth and observation. Platoons teaching other platoons what worked, what movements triggered the most German response, what patterns of sound and silence created maximum psychological impact. And there's something almost experimental about the Canadian reports from this period. Officers writing about trying different approaches, like scientists testing variables. What happened if they moved every 10 minutes versus every 30? What happened if they used only natural sounds versus letting equipment make noise? What happened if they positioned the same way 3 nights running versus constantly changing patterns? And the conclusion was that unpredictability produced the best results. That the moment Germans thought they had figured out a pattern and prepared for it, changing that pattern destroyed whatever psychological adaptation they had achieved. One Canadian sergeant from Manitoba wrote in a letter home that night, operations felt more like hunting bears than combat, that you needed the same patience, the same respect for your target's capabilities, the same understanding that rushing would get you killed while careful, persistent pressure would eventually create an opening, and that hunting metaphor appears repeatedly in Canadian accounts, suggesting a shared cultural framework that military training hadn't provided but personal experience had. Men who understood intrinsically that predators don't announce themselves. Predators make themselves known just enough to trigger fear, but not enough to allow effective response. Now here's what made this particularly devastating from the German perspective. They couldn't retaliate in kind because their entire defensive strategy depended on holding prepared positions. They couldn't send men wandering around Canadian lines at night because that would mean abandoning their defensive advantage. So this was asymmetric in the purest sense. Canadians could apply pressure the Germans couldn't return, which violated the reciprocal nature most soldiers expect from combat. The unspoken rule that, if you hit me, I can hit you back. But this was hitting that allowed no effective response, just absorption of pressure until something broke. The psychological impact went beyond immediate tactical effects. German units that survived weeks of Canadian night operations and were then rotated to quieter sectors showed lasting symptoms, what we would now recognize as hypervigilance and sleep disorders. Men who couldn't adjust to normal combat rhythms because they had been conditioned to expect threats from darkness that followed no predictable pattern. And medical reports from German field hospitals in late summer 1944 show an uptick in stress-related casualties from units that had faced Canadian night tactics. Men who weren't wounded but weren't combat effective, diagnosed with exhaustion or nervous strain that wouldn't resolve with normal rest periods. By September 1944, as Canadian forces pushed deeper into France and Belgium, the night routine had become so normalized that new replacement troops learned it from veterans during their first night in the line, learned that when darkness came, you didn't just sit in your position, you moved. You made your presence known to whatever Germans were across from you. You denied them the comfort of believing they were secure in their bunkers, and this informal transmission of tactical culture, from veteran to replacement, created a self-perpetuating system that required no orders from command. It just existed as the way we do things at night. And that kind of organic tactical evolution is rare in military history. Usually armies are top-down institutions where doctrine flows from command to troops. But this flowed laterally, spreading through the ranks because it worked, because it kept casualties lower than direct assault, because it gave individual soldiers agency in their survival rather than making them wait passively for orders to attack. There's an interesting note in a British liaison officer's report from August 1944 where he observes Canadian units preparing for night operations and comments that the Canadians seem unnervingly comfortable in darkness and that their night movements lack the hesitation and bunching he sees in British units conducting similar operations. And he attributes this to Canadian rural backgrounds, to familiarity with wilderness environments where artificial light doesn't exist and navigation by starlight is normal. And while this is partially stereotyping, it's also partially accurate. Census data from 1940s Canada shows that roughly 40% of Canadian soldiers came from rural areas versus about 15% for British soldiers, meaning a much larger proportion of Canadian troops had personal experience with extended periods in unlit environments, had developed the spatial awareness and comfort with darkness that urban populations often lack. The diary that started this whole historical revelation ends in mid-August 1944 with an entry that's almost literary in its despair, the German lieutenant writing that he used to fear death, used to fear injury, but now he fears night more than either of those because death is final and injury heals, but night comes back every 24 hours, bringing the certainty that somewhere in the darkness, Canadians are moving, watching, waiting, and he can't stop them, can't predict them, can't even prove they're there until dawn shows their tracks. And he writes that he finally understands what psychological warfare truly means, that it's not propaganda or leaflets, It's the systematic destruction of a soldier's sense of security, the removal of any moment where you can relax because the enemy has made themselves into an ambient threat that never fully materializes but never fully disappears. His unit surrendered on August 19th. Not overrun, not defeated in battle, they simply walked out of their positions with white flags when Canadian forces approached in daylight, and post-war interviews with some of those survivors reveal that they feared court-martial for desertion less than they feared another night in those positions, which tells you everything about the psychological calculus Canadian tactics had created. When military historians finally started analyzing this phenomenon seriously, in the 1990s and early 2000s, they struggled to categorize it because it doesn't fit neatly into conventional warfare analysis. It's not infantry tactics in the textbook sense. It's not special operations because it was done by regular line units. It's not psychological operations because it wasn't coordinated by psychological warfare specialists. It existed in this weird tactical space between combat and intimidation, between presence and absence, and the term that eventually emerged was ambient psychological warfare. The idea that you could degrade enemy capability not through direct engagement, but through sustained environmental pressure that made their defensive positions feel like traps rather than sanctuaries. The legacy of Canadian night tactics from 1944 appears in modern military doctrine around persistent low-level contact operations and in counterinsurgency strategies where presence matters as much as firepower. But it's rarely taught as a historical case study because it lacks the narrative drama military historians usually prefer. There's no Thermopylae moment, no heroic sacrifice, just months of German positions slowly collapsing under patient pressure, applied by soldiers who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that kills, but the one that prevents sleep, prevents rest, prevents the psychological recovery that makes organized defense possible. That German officer's diary, now housed in military archives in both Germany and Canada, remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what it felt like to be strategically defeated, not through superior force, but through superior understanding of human psychology under stress, and researchers who have studied it note that his descriptions of deteriorating morale and cohesion match almost perfectly with modern research on sleep deprivation and chronic stress in military contexts, suggesting that Canadian troops in 1944 had somehow intuited principles of psychological warfare that wouldn't be formally studied until decades later. If you found this perspective on WW2 valuable, if you appreciate history told from the angle of what worked rather than just what was dramatic, this channel explores exactly these kinds of forgotten tactical innovations and strategic decisions that changed outcomes without making headlines. So subscribe if you want more stories about how wars were actually fought versus how we remember them being fought, and drop a comment telling me which front or theater you want explored next, because there are dozens of these psychological and tactical innovations that official histories barely mention, moments when individual units figured out something doctrine manuals hadn't taught them and changed the nature of combat in their sector. And those stories deserve to be told, not because they're heroic but because they're true, because they show how warfare evolves through improvisation and cultural adaptation as much as through formal strategy, and because understanding what actually worked in past conflicts matters more than memorizing the dates and names that textbooks emphasize. The Canadians who developed these night tactics never wrote manifestos about them, never claimed to have revolutionized warfare. Most of them probably never even thought of it as special. It was just what you did when you needed to take German positions without losing half your men in frontal assaults. And that casual practicality, that willingness to try something because textbook answers weren't working, that represents a kind of military innovation that bureaucracies struggle to create deliberately, but that emerges naturally when you give combat soldiers enough autonomy to experiment with solutions to immediate problems. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that some of the most effective tactics in military history came from people who were just trying to survive their next week in the line and stumbled onto something that worked better than what command had taught them, and were smart enough to keep using it, refining it, teaching it to the next group of replacements, creating informal doctrine that spread through example rather than orders, which is how military culture actually evolves, even though that's not how military institutions like to think they work. Remember how confident those German positions seemed in June 1944. Dug into Norman hedgerows they had been fortifying for 4 years, and remember how little time it took for that confidence to erode once darkness became hostile territory, once night stopped being a break from combat and became its own kind of battlefield, where visibility didn't matter, because presence was the weapon. And ask yourself what other assumptions about warfare or strategy or human conflict generally might look unshakable, until someone figures out the one approach that bypasses all the conventional defenses and attacks something more fundamental than positions or firepower. Something like the psychological need for security or rest, or the belief that you understand what your enemy will do next. Because the moment you make someone doubt those basic assumptions, the moment you turn their defensive advantages into sources of anxiety, the battle is already half won before anyone fires a shot. What nobody talks about regarding Canadian night tactics is what happened when German command finally tried to counter them, because by late August 1944, Wehrmacht officers weren't stupid. They recognized they were being psychologically dismantled, and they attempted systematic responses, and every single countermeasure they implemented made the situation worse, which teaches you something profound about how organizations respond to threats they don't fully understand. They apply more of what already isn't working. They add structure to problems that require flexibility, and in doing so, they accelerate their own collapse in ways that look obvious in hindsight, but were invisible to people living through it. The first countermeasure came from a German major, stationed near Falaise, who decided that if Canadians were using darkness as a weapon, then his units would simply eliminate darkness, and he ordered the installation of additional floodlights around defensive perimeters, massive searchlights that could illuminate 200 meters of approach terrain, and he was so confident this would solve the problem that he wrote in a report that artificial illumination will restore tactical clarity and allow proper defensive fire. And what actually happened was that those floodlights became targeting beacons that told Canadian mortar teams exactly where German positions were located. The lights created harsh shadows that made it easier for Canadian infantry to approach from angles the lights couldn't cover. And most devastatingly, the lights attracted every Allied artillery observer within 10 kilometers, who could now see German positions that had previously been camouflaged by darkness and terrain. So this major's attempt to eliminate the darkness advantage instead eliminated his own concealment, and his positions took 3 times more artillery fire than neighboring sectors. And Canadian night movements continued exactly as before, except now they had better intelligence about German defensive layouts thanks to the illumination his searchlights provided. The second countermeasure involved aggressive patrols, German units sending out their own night patrols to intercept Canadian movement, essentially trying to fight fire with fire. And this sounds logical until you realize that German defensive doctrine was built around static positions with interlocking fields of fire. Sending men outside those positions at night meant abandoning the very advantage their fortifications provided. And Canadian forces who encountered these German patrols didn't engage in extended firefights. They either avoided them entirely or hit them fast and withdrew, which meant German patrols would stumble around in darkness making noise, accomplishing nothing, returning exhausted to their positions having burned energy, and learned nothing about Canadian intentions. And worse, having a patrol out meant the main defensive position couldn't fire freely at sounds and movement because they might hit their own men, which gave Canadian units operating in those sectors even more freedom to move close to German lines. So this countermeasure actually reduced German defensive effectiveness while increasing the psychological strain on everyone involved, because now German soldiers in bunkers had to worry not just about Canadians in the darkness, but about accidentally shooting their own patrols. The third countermeasure was perhaps the most telling, which was a directive from German command that units facing Canadian sectors should maintain what they called aggressive defensive posture, which in plain language meant they should conduct raids and probing attacks during daytime to seize initiative and force Canadians into reactive mode. And several German units tried this in early September 1944, launching company-strength attacks against Canadian positions during daylight hours. And these attacks were military disasters. They were moving against prepared Canadian defenses that had excellent fields of fire and strong artillery support, and the casualties were severe enough that the policy was quietly abandoned after 2 weeks. But the damage was already done because German units that had been conserving strength for defensive operations had now burned through combat-effective soldiers in poorly planned offensive actions. And the reason they had attempted these attacks in the first place was desperation to do something, anything that felt like regaining control after weeks of feeling hunted at night. If you're wondering why German command couldn't just study what worked and adapt it, the answer is cultural and structural. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and adherence to established principles, which worked brilliantly when those principles matched the operational environment, but became a liability when facing tactics that exploited gaps in doctrine, and Canadian night operations existed in one of those gaps. There was no manual chapter on how to defend against sustained psychological presence without engagement, no training scenario that prepared officers for positions collapsing from exhaustion rather than combat losses, and the German military system in 1944 was too rigid and too strained by losses on multiple fronts to develop adaptive solutions to novel tactical problems. They needed their defenders to hold positions using established methods because they didn't have the time, resources, or institutional flexibility to reinvent defensive doctrine in the middle of a campaign. Meanwhile, Canadian units were evolving their techniques based on what they learned each night. Some platoons started incorporating recorded sounds, playing back equipment noise they had recorded during the day, to create the impression of movement in one area, while actual troops moved somewhere else. Other units began leaving small signs of their presence deliberately, cigarette butts placed where German patrols would find them, boot prints in mud leading up to, but not away from German positions, implying someone was still there. Personal items like gloves or ration tins dropped close enough to defensive perimeters to be discovered at dawn. And these psychological touches, these deliberate hints that Canadians had been even closer than the Germans suspected, created cumulative paranoia that statistics can't measure, but diary entries document extensively. German soldiers writing about finding evidence that enemy troops had been within meters of their positions while they slept, wondering what stopped those Canadians from just attacking. And that question, that wondering why the attack didn't come, was often more psychologically damaging than if the attack had actually happened, because it meant the next night and the night after and every night thereafter carried the same question, the same uncertainty, the same inability to predict when presence would become violence. By October 1944, as fighting moved into Belgium and then toward the German border, the character of Canadian night operations shifted slightly because the tactical situation changed. They were now attacking into Germany proper, facing defenders who were protecting their homeland rather than occupied territory. And this changed German motivation. Soldiers defending France could rationalize retreat and surrender. Soldiers defending German soil felt different pressures, but the night tactics adapted, became if anything more psychological and less about physical presence, because Canadian units recognized that German morale was simultaneously more brittle and more desperate, more likely to break under sustained pressure, but also more likely to fight suicidally when broken. So the approach became about identifying which German units were fragile and which were fanatical, applying night pressure to the fragile ones until they collapsed, and then bypassing the fanatical ones for follow-up forces to contain, essentially using night operations as a sorting mechanism to identify where German defenses could be psychologically fractured versus where they needed to be physically destroyed. There's a fascinating Canadian intelligence report from November 1944 that analyzes German defensive behavior by unit type and concludes that Wehrmacht regular army units remained susceptible to night psychological operations, but SS units and Hitler Youth formations showed different response patterns. They would maintain fire discipline longer, show less degradation from sleep deprivation, but also become more erratic and violent when they did break, meaning Canadian units facing SS positions couldn't rely on the gradual collapse model that worked against regular Wehrmacht. They needed to be prepared for either fanatical resistance or sudden violent breakdown with no middle ground. And this required company commanders to make judgment calls about whether night operations would soften a position or just provoke a suicidal defense that would cost more Canadian lives than a straightforward assault. which shows how these tactics were never one-size-fits-all solutions. They required constant assessment and adaptation based on who you were facing and what psychological state they were in. One incident that illustrates the double-edged nature of psychological warfare happened in December 1944, when a Canadian company spent 3 nights applying their usual routine to what they believed was a Wehrmacht position near the German-Belgian border. And on the 4th night, when they moved close to probe for weak points, they encountered not exhaustion and demoralization, but a coordinated counterattack by Hitler Youth, who had been waiting for exactly that approach. And the Canadians took casualties and had to withdraw. And the after-action analysis concluded that the Hitler Youth commander had recognized what was happening, had deliberately accepted 3 nights of psychological pressure specifically to set a trap for the 4th night, betting that Canadian confidence would lead them into range. And this German commander was right. He successfully turned Canadian doctrine against them for 1 night. But the cost was that his unit endured 3 nights of stress they didn't need to endure, and burned ammunition. They couldn't replace just to achieve a minor tactical victory that didn't change the strategic situation. And this illustrates something important about psychological warfare, that even when the target recognizes what's happening and tries to counter it, the act of countering it still extracts a psychological and material cost, still diverts energy and focus from other defensive priorities, still represents a victory for the attacker, even when the specific tactic fails. As the war moved into 1945 and German defensive capabilities degraded further, Canadian night operations became less about psychological pressure and more about reconnaissance and exploitation, using the same movement techniques but for different purposes, infiltrating German lines to identify weak points, prisoner snatching, cutting communication wires, essentially transitioning from psychological warfare to economy of force operations. And this transition was organic, happened without formal orders because company commanders recognized that the psychological approach worked best against coherent defensive organizations. And by early 1945, many German positions weren't coherent organizations anymore. They were a collection of exhausted soldiers with poor supply, poor communication, and poor morale who didn't need additional psychological pressure to collapse. They just needed to be pushed, so the night tactics evolved to become more aggressive and more focused on exploitation rather than degradation. The last documented use of pure psychological night operations appears to be in March 1945 near the Rhine, where a Canadian battalion facing a German position that intelligence suggested was understrength and demoralized, spent 5 nights running their old routine, sustained presence without engagement, and on the 6th day the German commander surrendered his entire unit without a fight, walked across to Canadian lines with a white flag, and explained through interpreters that his men hadn't slept properly in a week, had burned through most of their ammunition shooting at sounds, and had reached a collective decision that continuing was pointless. And he asked only that his surrender be recorded as occurring after resistance, so he wouldn't be charged with desertion under German military law, which tells you how thoroughly the psychological calculus had shifted. This German officer knew he was beaten, knew his men were beaten, but still needed the bureaucratic fiction that he had fought before surrendering, because even in collapse, the weight of military culture and fear of consequences shaped behavior. When the war ended and military historians began compiling official records, Canadian night operations barely appeared in Commonwealth battle summaries. They were mentioned in passing in unit histories, acknowledged in some after-action reports, but never analyzed as a significant tactical innovation, and this obscurity persisted until the 1990s, when researchers examining German archives started finding diary entries and intelligence reports that consistently referenced Canadian night activity as a major factor in defensive failures. And even then, it took the discovery of that particular German officer's diary to catalyze serious historical attention, because his descriptions were so detailed and so psychologically revealing that they couldn't be dismissed as typical war memoir embellishment. They documented with daily precision exactly how psychological pressure applied over time, degraded military effectiveness in ways that looked nothing like combat, but achieved combat objectives. Modern military theorists who study this case tend to focus on 2 aspects. First, the cultural component, The idea that Canadian rural backgrounds and hunting experience created an informal tactical advantage that military training hadn't provided, and second, the organizational component. The fact that Canadian command allowed company and platoon-level officers enough autonomy to experiment with unorthodox approaches rather than demanding strict adherence to doctrine. And both these factors together created conditions where tactical innovation could emerge from the bottom up and spread laterally through the force. And this bottom-up innovation model runs counter to how most people think military organizations work. We imagine tactics being designed by staff officers and taught to troops, but this case demonstrates that some of the most effective tactics emerge from troops adapting to immediate problems and then teaching their solutions to other troops, creating informal doctrine that exists alongside official doctrine and sometimes contradicts it, but works better in specific contexts. The veterans who participated in these night operations rarely talked about them after the war, not because they were classified or traumatic, but because they seemed unremarkable compared to major battles and dramatic moments that defined popular narratives of WW2. Most of these men came home, resumed civilian lives, and when they told war stories they talked about D-Day, or liberation of towns or seeing the concentration camps. They didn't talk about the dozens of nights they spent walking around German positions making noise, and this disconnect between what was tactically significant and what was narratively memorable explains why this aspect of the war remained obscure for 50 years. It simply wasn't the kind of story that fit how veterans were expected to remember combat. There was no heroism in it, no glory, just professional effectiveness applied patiently over months until the enemy's will degraded. And that kind of warfare doesn't produce the material that war movies or adventure books are made from, which is precisely why it's worth understanding. Because most warfare throughout history has been more like this than like the dramatic battles we memorialize. It's been about logistics and morale and psychological attrition and the slow grinding down of enemy capability through means that look boring in retrospect, but were terrifyingly effective to people experiencing them. The German officer whose diary sparked renewed interest died in 1987. Without ever knowing his wartime writings would become historically significant, his family said he rarely discussed the war, seemed to have processed it privately, and the notebooks they found after his grandson discovered them in the attic contained not just battle descriptions, but philosophical reflections on fear, duty, and the collapse of certainty that came from being a professional soldier whose training suddenly seemed inadequate for the kind of warfare he faced. And reading those entries now with 70 years of hindsight, they feel remarkably modern. His descriptions of anxiety and hypervigilance and the inability to trust his own perceptions mirror almost exactly what contemporary soldiers describe experiencing in counterinsurgency environments where the threat is ambient rather than direct, where you know the enemy is present but can't predict when or where they'll manifest. And this suggests that the psychological dimensions of warfare are more consistent across contexts than the technological or tactical dimensions, that human beings under sustained stress respond in patterns that are recognizable, whether they're dealing with Canadian night movements in 1944, or IED threats in 2004, or drone surveillance in 2024. The technology and tactics change, but the psychological experience of living under constant, unpredictable threat remains fundamentally similar. If this exploration of forgotten tactical innovations interests you, if you value understanding how wars were actually fought by the people who fought them, rather than how they're portrayed in official histories and popular culture, this channel exists specifically to excavate these kinds of stories. The decisions and techniques and innovations that worked but didn't make headlines. And subscribing means you'll see more analysis of military history from the perspective of what was effective rather than what was dramatic, which are often completely different things. And I'm genuinely curious what other forgotten tactics or overlooked innovations you think deserve this kind of attention. So leave a comment with your suggestions, because there are countless examples across different conflicts and different militaries of people figuring out solutions that doctrine hadn't anticipated. And those stories matter not because they're exciting, but because they're true. Because they show how human beings adapt under pressure, how organizations either enable or suppress innovation, and how effectiveness in conflict often comes from understanding psychology as much as understanding weapons, from recognizing that the goal isn't always to destroy the enemy, but sometimes just to make the enemy destroy themselves through exhaustion and fear and the cumulative weight of stress that official casualty statistics never capture, but that determines outcomes as surely as any battle. What happened after the war tells you everything about how military institutions process innovations they didn't authorize, because Canadian night tactics should have become a case study in every staff college, should have been analyzed and codified and taught to future generations of officers, but instead they disappeared into filing cabinets for 50 years. And the reason for this institutional amnesia reveals something uncomfortable about how military bureaucracies work. They celebrate innovations that fit existing narratives about courage and firepower and technological superiority, but they don't know what to do with innovations that succeeded through patience and psychological manipulation and cultural advantages that can't be replicated through training, so they simply don't celebrate them at all. They acknowledge them in footnotes and move on to stories that reinforce the institutional self-image they prefer. The immediate post-war analysis done by Canadian military historians in 1945 and 1946 mentioned night operations in passing, usually in the context of aggressive patrolling or active defense, using bland terminology that completely missed the psychological warfare dimension. And when British and American analysts reviewed Canadian operational performance, they focused almost entirely on conventional metrics like casualty ratios and territorial gains and speed of advance. They had no framework for assessing the effectiveness of tactics that worked by degrading enemy capability before engagement rather than during engagement. And this analytical blindness wasn't malicious, it was structural. Military institutions measure what they value, and they valued things they could quantify like ammunition, expended per enemy killed or ground captured per day. They didn't value things like enemy psychological state or sustainability of defensive morale, because those weren't part of the analytical toolkit that staff officers learned to use. The German side provides even less formal analysis, because by 1945, Wehrmacht record-keeping had collapsed along with everything else, and in the immediate post-war years, German veterans weren't exactly sitting down to write objective assessments of why they lost. They were dealing with occupation and denazification and basic survival. So the German perspective on Canadian night tactics remained locked in private diaries and personal memories that weren't accessible to historians until decades later, when enough time had passed that discussing military defeats wasn't politically or emotionally fraught. The first serious academic attention came in the early 1970s, when a Canadian military historian named Douglas Patterson was researching a book about Canadian infantry tactics in Northwest Europe and kept finding references in unit war diaries to night operations that seemed inconsistent with standard doctrine, and Patterson was meticulous enough to notice that these references clustered in certain units and certain time periods, suggesting this wasn't random patrolling but something more systematic. And he interviewed about 40 Canadian veterans who had served in those units, and their descriptions were remarkably consistent. They all described similar approaches to night movement, similar philosophies about psychological pressure, similar observations about German responses, and Patterson published a paper in 1976 titled Informal Doctrine: Canadian Night Operations in Normandy, that argued these tactics represented a bottom-up innovation that official histories had completely overlooked. And that paper was mostly ignored by mainstream military historians because it didn't fit the established narrative about how the Normandy campaign was fought, and Patterson died in 1989 without seeing his work achieve broader recognition. The breakthrough came in the mid-1990s, when German archives became more accessible after reunification, and researchers started finding Wehrmacht documents that corroborated exactly what Patterson had argued. Intelligence reports from German units facing Canadian sectors that described sustained night pressure, after-action reports that attributed position losses to morale collapse rather than combat defeats, and medical records showing elevated stress casualties in units that had faced prolonged Canadian night operations. And suddenly, Patterson's forgotten paper became relevant again, because now there was evidence from both sides confirming that something significant had happened that official histories hadn't captured. And this sparked a small wave of research in the late 1990s and early 2000s that produced several academic articles and one book-length treatment that finally gave Canadian night tactics the analytical attention they deserved. But this research remained mostly confined to specialized military history circles. It never broke through to popular consciousness because it lacked the narrative elements that make history accessible to general audiences. There were no famous battles, no heroic individuals, no dramatic turning points, just months of sustained psychological pressure applied by hundreds of ordinary soldiers whose names nobody remembers. Modern military theorists who encounter this case study tend to have one of two reactions. Either they dismiss it as situational and non-replicable because it depended on specific cultural factors and enemy vulnerabilities that don't exist in contemporary conflicts, or they become fascinated by it as an example of economy of force operations that achieved strategic effects through minimal resource expenditure. And the second group tends to be people who have experience with counterinsurgency or special operations, where psychological dimensions of warfare matter more than conventional firepower. And they recognize in Canadian night tactics a principle that remains valid, which is that human beings under sustained, unpredictable stress make worse decisions, maintain worse discipline, and eventually reach breaking points that have nothing to do with how well-armed or well-trained they are. The closest modern parallel appears in counterinsurgency doctrine around persistent presence operations, where security forces maintain constant low-level activity in contested areas, specifically to deny insurgents the psychological comfort of safe havens, and the logic is identical to what Canadians discovered in 1944, that you can degrade enemy capability not through decisive engagement, but through sustained pressure that prevents rest, prevents planning, prevents the mental recovery necessary for effective operations, and militaries that understand this principle tend to be more successful in irregular warfare environments than militaries that focus exclusively on conventional battle. But implementing this understanding requires organizational flexibility and decentralized command that many military institutions struggle to maintain because it contradicts their hierarchical instincts. One fascinating application of Canadian night tactics principles happened in the 1990s, when Canadian peacekeepers in the Balkans faced situations where they needed to deter ethnic militias without escalating to open combat. And some units, particularly those with veterans who remembered hearing stories about WW2 night operations from their fathers or grandfathers, adapted those techniques to peacekeeping context, conducting highly visible patrols through contested areas at unpredictable times, maintaining presence in locations where militias expected UN forces to avoid, essentially using presence and unpredictability to create psychological deterrence. And while the context was completely different, the principle was the same, that sustained visibility of capability can be as effective as actual use of capability in shaping adversary behavior. And this worked well enough that it was incorporated into Canadian peacekeeping doctrine. In the late 1990s, though, without explicit acknowledgement of its WW2 origins, because institutional memory in military organizations is surprisingly short and disconnected across generations. The question of whether Canadian night tactics could work against modern military forces is interesting, because it depends entirely on what modern means. If you're talking about peer adversaries with night vision technology and persistent surveillance drones, then obviously the specific techniques from 1944 wouldn't work. You can't rely on darkness to hide movement when the enemy has thermal imaging. But if you're talking about the underlying principle that sustained psychological pressure degrades combat effectiveness regardless of technological capability, then yes, that absolutely still applies. We see it in how insurgent groups use IEDs not primarily to inflict casualties, but to create constant stress that degrades decision-making quality in conventional forces. We see it in how information warfare creates ambient anxiety that affects entire populations. We see it in how cyber attacks that don't directly damage critical infrastructure still impose psychological and organizational costs just from the uncertainty and response requirements they create. The technology changes, but the human response to sustained, unpredictable threat remains consistent. The veterans who participated in Canadian night operations and lived long enough to see renewed historical interest in the 1990s and 2000s, generally expressed surprise that anyone cared. Most of them maintained it was just common sense applied to specific situations, nothing special or innovative, just doing what worked, and that modesty is typical of people who were genuinely effective at warfare. They don't mythologize what they did because they remember it as problem-solving under pressure. Not heroism, but that modesty also obscures the significance of what they accomplished, which was discovering through trial and error a form of psychological warfare that official doctrine hadn't anticipated and that enemy doctrine couldn't counter. And they did this not because they were exceptional individuals, but because the organizational structure they operated within gave them permission to experiment and learn from results, which is actually the deeper lesson here, that tactical innovation emerges from command cultures that tolerate experimentation more than from brilliant individuals who invent perfect solutions. If you look at military history broadly, you find that most significant tactical innovations followed this same pattern. They emerged from people facing immediate problems who tried unconventional approaches because conventional approaches weren't working. And then those innovations spread informally through forces until they became standard practice. And only later did staff officers codify them into official doctrine and claim institutional credit. But the actual innovation happened in the field among people who were just trying to survive and accomplish their missions and were willing to break from what they'd been taught when what they'd been taught proved inadequate. The Canadian experience with night operations fits perfectly into this pattern. Nobody sat in a planning room and designed this approach. It emerged from a lieutenant asking, "What if we tried this?" and discovering it worked and teaching it to other officers who tried it themselves and refined it further. And within weeks it had spread through an entire division without a single formal order being issued about it, purely through demonstration and imitation. And that kind of organic spread is only possible in organizations where authority is decentralized enough that company and platoon commanders feel empowered to deviate from doctrine when circumstances warrant. The psychological impact on German forces from facing Canadian night operations extended beyond immediate tactical effects into how those German veterans remembered the war decades later. Several oral history projects done in the 1980s and 1990s found that German veterans who had faced Canadian units in Northwest Europe described that experience differently from how they described facing British or American units. They used words like unnerving and relentless and inhuman, not because Canadians were more brutal, but because the night tactics created a sense of being hunted rather than being fought, and that hunting metaphor appears consistently enough in German accounts to suggest it captured something real about the psychological experience. The feeling that your opponent wasn't trying to defeat you in fair combat, but was systematically wearing you down like a predator exhausts prey. And that comparison bothered German soldiers, not because it was inaccurate, but because it felt accurate. It matched their experience of being in positions that should have been defensible, but somehow weren't, of having every advantage on paper, but feeling vulnerable anyway. The broader strategic impact of Canadian night tactics is impossible to quantify precisely because they operated in concert with conventional operations, artillery, air support, armor, all the normal components of combined arms warfare. So you can't isolate their contribution and say, this position fell because of night operations versus this position fell because of artillery. But what you can say is that Canadian divisions advancing through Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945 consistently encountered less organized resistance than their rate of advance would predict. They consistently captured more prisoners relative to enemy killed than other Allied formations, and they consistently reported German positions surrendering or collapsing with less combat than staff estimates projected. And while multiple factors contributed to these outcomes, the night operations certainly played a role, probably a significant role, in degrading German defensive cohesion before major attacks began, essentially shaping the battlefield psychologically before shaping it physically. One aspect that makes this story particularly relevant today is that it demonstrates how cultural background and life experience can create military advantages that formal training can't replicate. The hunting and wilderness experience that many Canadian soldiers brought from rural backgrounds gave them comfort with darkness and environmental awareness that proved tactically valuable, and this raises interesting questions about how modern militaries recruit and what capabilities they prioritize. Most contemporary military forces recruit primarily from urban and suburban populations who have very different life experiences and skill sets than the rural populations that dominated military recruitment in the 1940s. And while modern technology can compensate for many things, it can't necessarily compensate for the kind of intuitive environmental awareness that comes from spending your formative years in places without artificial light and urban infrastructure. So maybe militaries should think more deliberately about what pre-existing capabilities different demographic groups bring, rather than assuming everyone arrives as blank slates to be molded by training. The ethical dimensions of psychological warfare tactics like Canadian night operations deserve consideration, because there's always a question about whether it's appropriate to deliberately inflict psychological suffering as opposed to physical harm, and the military ethics literature on this is unsettled. Some ethicists argue that psychological warfare is actually more humane because it achieves military objectives with lower casualties on both sides. Others argue that psychological trauma can be more lasting and harder to treat than physical wounds, so it's not obviously more humane, and both positions have merit. But what's clear from the Canadian case is that these tactics were developed pragmatically, not from ethical reasoning but from tactical necessity. Soldiers were trying to accomplish missions with minimum friendly casualties and discovered that psychological pressure worked better than direct assault for certain objectives. And the ethics were worked out afterward, if at all, which is typical of how warfare actually develops. Tactical innovations emerge from field necessity, and ethical frameworks attempt to catch up later and impose retroactive justification or condemnation. The long-term legacy of Canadian night operations exists less in specific doctrinal changes and more in a general awareness within military history that psychological dimensions matter, that wars aren't won purely through firepower and maneuver, that morale and cohesion and will to fight are variables that can be deliberately manipulated, and that sometimes the most effective approach isn't the most direct approach. And these insights have been absorbed into how serious military professionals think about conflict. Even if they don't specifically reference Canadian night tactics when discussing them, the ideas have permeated strategic culture, even as the specific historical example remains obscure. What we're left with is a story that challenges comfortable narratives about warfare. It wasn't about heroes or technology or superior firepower. It was about understanding that human beings break under sustained psychological pressure, and that darkness can be weaponized if you're comfortable in it and your enemy isn't, and that victory sometimes looks like nothing at all, just positions that should have held but didn't, enemy soldiers who should have fought but surrendered, resistance that should have lasted weeks collapsing in days, and nobody could point to a moment where the battle was won because there was no battle in the conventional sense, just the slow dissolution of enemy capability under pressure that was real but invisible, measurable in diary entries and medical reports but not in battle maps or casualty statistics. If you've stayed with this exploration of forgotten tactical innovation, if you appreciate military history told from the perspective of what actually happened rather than what makes good cinema, then you understand why this channel exists. To excavate these stories that official histories overlooked, to show how warfare really works when stripped of mythology and propaganda. And subscribing means you'll continue getting this perspective on conflicts across different eras, because these patterns repeat. People under pressure innovate, institutions resist innovation, eventually effectiveness wins over orthodoxy, and the cycle continues. So hit subscribe if you want to see more analysis of how wars were fought by the people who fought them, and leave a comment telling me what other forgotten innovations or overlooked tactics deserve this treatment. Because military history is full of moments where someone figured out something that worked brilliantly, used it effectively, and then watched it disappear into obscurity. Because it didn't fit the narrative institutions wanted to tell about themselves, and those moments matter not for patriotic or nostalgic reasons, but because they teach us how humans adapt under extreme pressure, how organizations either enable or suppress that adaptation, and how effectiveness in conflict often comes from understanding psychology as deeply as understanding weapons, from recognizing that the most powerful force multiplier isn't technology or numbers, But understanding how and why people break, and having the patience and cultural framework to apply that understanding systematically over time until the enemy's will collapses without their positions ever being overrun, which is exactly what Canadian soldiers discovered in the Norman hedgerows in 1944, and refined over months until German officers feared darkness more than bullets. And if that doesn't change how you think about warfare and innovation, and the difference between what history remembers and what history forgets, then I don't know what will.